What can you say about someone who's a master of words, especially when he told me to cut out all the juicy parts about his bio? He's a master of words who's published several books on poetry, Empirical Evidence, Homage to Mr. Oppenheimer, and Splendor. And he also serves as one of our key librarians at the West Campus. So the Faculty Publications series was meant to help you guys get access to our faculty and librarians and others here at the Kendall campus and at West Campus and other campuses who have published books. How did they get from A to B? So you can reverse engineer their success. And sometimes you come across these masters of their crafts and you kind of just walk in and out of their classrooms without being fully aware of the people that you're interacting with, that they may have been on several albums with the Bee Gees, or produced an award-winning film, or published several books of poetry, as is the case with Mr. Kronen. So we would like to welcome up to the stage Mr. Steve Kronen. We haven't completely organized this, so you get that microphone.
Oh, okay.
And I think we'll start with the questions, is that all right? And then maybe...
Certainly.
Oh, very good. And
Yep.
we'll leave an interlude for a few polls.
Certainly.
Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to recognize a counter-curator of the Faculty Publications, Brenda Kilmer and Jennifer Tipton. And our music department chairperson, Mr. James Broderick, and our director of libraries, campus-wide, Eric Domenicis, who've made it possible to keep this piano here. So we're going to transition from the music into poetry, and I'm going to ask you, just in terms of sound,
Okay.
what are your favorite word sounds?
Mellifluous is a mellifluous word. I've read somewhere that somebody thought syphilis was a beautiful sounding word. So I mean, it's interesting to think of the discordance between perhaps sound and meaning, because they're not always obviously going to align with each other. So,
how about little particles of words? Just, you know, a couple words, a couple letters together that don't quite make a word. Are there any sounds you're fond of? That's it. All right, very good. If any others occur to you, please add them. I want to ask you a question. As a poet, do you write every day? And do you have deadlines? Do you set them for yourself, or do others set them for you?
That's a good question. I write every day when I'm writing. If I'm on a poem, then I'm usually obsessed with it and thinking about it all the time. And if I'm driving, I have it next to me, so at a red light I can scratch down something that I'm thinking of. And I'm fairly obsessed. But then I'll go periods between poems where I'm not doing anything. And it's been a while now, actually, and I'm getting a little worried. Because I haven't, well, it hasn't been that long, maybe a month or two. And when I hit dry spells like this, I don't even want to call them dry spells. What I'll do is I'll do quote-unquote translations. I'll read poems from different languages that I don't necessarily understand myself, but I'll read, let's say, 10 translations of a given poem, and then I'll do my own version of it. And that keeps the wheels turning, at least if I'm not producing something utterly original. I'm exploring different languages, different thoughts, and different ways to come up with a poem that's been translated elsewhere.
Cool. So you do have dry spots, and there's times when you have to seek out inspiration. So let me ask you a question. What are your favorite muses? What do you like, your subjects? What inspires you?
Yeah, you know, I think you have to meet the muse halfway. If you sit around and wait for inspiration, the muse isn't going to show up. You have to show goodwill, I think, on your end. And so just start playing, just start writing. I mean, it's the same with if you have to do a paper for class. You can wait till 3 a.m. the night before and freak out. Or you can start working on it. And as you guys have discovered, as you're working on a paper, that generates the material that you'll be working on in the paper. In the same, I think, with writing in general. You have to prime the pump.
But are there themes or poems or people? Excuse me, themes or ideas or people that keep finding their way into your poems?
Yes, one of the poems, I think, actually two of them. I'm kind of obsessed with aging, something we all do. And so the fact of getting older keeps showing up in my poems, and maybe 1.5 poems that we're going to look at today deal with aging. That seeps its way in. But kind of what I'm saying before, quite often, as when you're writing a paper, you don't know what you're going to discover. So a poem might start with subject A, but it ends up with subject Z, because it suggests itself as it's writing all the time. And as a writer, you have to be attentive to what the poem wants to say too. But you, as the craftsperson, you have to guide that poem while you're writing too. Otherwise, it's just, babbling.
So I want to ask you a question. We've talked about aging and this one end of the spectrum of life.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember when you were young, I presume when you were young, and you first were bit by the poetry bug, do you happen to remember the particular poem that first had an effect on you?
I remember one I wrote in 5th grade. It was an assignment in 5th grade, and you guys won't remember this, but there was a commercials on TV, really sexist commercials. Is she a blonde or not? Only the hairdresser knows, was the catchline for these commercials. Do you remember this?
Vaguely, yes.
Pat, do you remember? Yeah. Only the hairdresser knows, and that was very cool. Is she really a blonde or not? So I wrote a poem in 5th grade. When a rabbit gets old and weary, can he tie his own shoes and button his clothes? When a rabbit gets old and dreary, only the hairdresser knows. So
it's like humor strikes. So how important is it for you, or was it for you, to become published? How does that change the way you view yourself as a poet? How does it change your interactions with the audiences? And is it something that needed to happen or helped your career?
That's a good question, and something I ask myself all the time. For example, I want to be, quote unquote, a poet. I want to write poetry. Well, is that not sufficient unto itself? But no, it's not sufficient unto itself. I want to be published. I want to be recognized. I want other people to read my work and pat me on the back. So, and when my first book came out, psychologically, it is a great aid. There it is. Or even before the first book, getting poems published here and there. It's the same with anything in life, no matter what you want to do. It's great to get affirmation for whatever one's endeavor is. And it does a little things. It clicks in your head a little bit and helps you. But I think we all have romantic views of movie stars or whatever. There's an old Zen saying, before I was enlightened, I chopped wood and carried water. After I was enlightened, I chopped wood and carried water. Life goes on. And because desire is insatiable, the Buddha tells us this. Oh, I got a poem published. That's great. Now I got to get 2 poems published. Oh, I got a book published. Now I got to get 2 books published. So part of our job as human beings is to deal with that insatiable desire and ask who we are on the planet Earth. And are we defined by what the world tells us? And it's inevitable. We are defined by what the world tells us. But how do we negotiate that as a human being on the planet Earth?
So do you feel like poetry's place in today's society, and that has changed so much, and the way words are spread throughout the globe and spread with the immediacy that they're spread, do you feel like poetry's place has been augmented or somewhat diminished, perhaps in, say, the last 10 or 15 years?
I would say augmented, in that, for the very reasons you're pointing out, in that, I mean, you can tap into your phone. I mean, before, as we all know, well, you guys don't know, you're all 20 years old. You had to go to the library and check out a poetry book, or go find poems in this or that magazine. And now, again, at 3 a.m., you can, and there's marvelous, marvelous poetry sites. And like anything else in the world, like in the music world, in any sort of endeavor, I mean, more people can do it, it seems, and there's a bell curve, no matter if it's a digital bell curve or not, wherein X amount is horrible, X amount is okay, and X amount stands up. And those things vary too, because what stands up today might not stand up tomorrow. So,
so I was going to ask you. You mentioned about aging, and something with that is a harvest of, hopefully, of good nature, of humankind, of being fully human. How is your view of what it means to be fully human today differ than what it meant to you when you were this age, when you were, say, 20 years old?
That's a really good question. And again, as I said, I'm obsessed with aging. And again, one of the poems kind of addresses this very question. You know, and I think all the time, you know, what would I tell my 20-year-old self? And as I say in the poem, my 20-year-old, it doesn't matter, my 20-year-old self wouldn't listen. So, state the question again.
What does it mean to you now to be fully human? And what do you think it meant to you at 20, if you can recall?
Well,
or do you imagine it meant?
I'll tell you, if you gave me $1 million, which sounded like a lot of money when I was your age, and doesn't now, which is the very point we're talking about, and this is no insult, I wouldn't be your age again for $1 million. It's nerve-wracking. It's awful. Especially, I mean, being 20 is worse than being 10, because the world tells you at 20, oh, you should know what you're doing now. It doesn't tell you that at 10, that oh, I got to decide my major, or oh, I got to go find a job, or I should get married, or it's awful. It's just awful. On the other hand, when you're 20, you have the energy to deal with that you don't have in your 60s. So I guess it evens itself out. And there's a wonderful sense when you're 20 of the world before you and all the possibility. And on the other hand, being a viejo now, there's a certain. Again, I should read the poem at some point. There's you learn to forgive yourself somewhat hopefully, in theory, you learn to forgive yourself. The stupidity of bad choices you've made, stupid things you've done. And I still do it now. I'll still like wake up at 3 in the morning and go, oh my God, I can't believe I said that to that person. But before I would have freaked out more at it. Now I still wake up and say that, and I say, well, it's okay. And that's the difference. That's the difference.
So as an artist and as someone who tries to communicate emotion with others, I want to ask you 2 questions, kind of twin forces, what you thought of them. How important to you are universals, those things to which we can all relate?
Uh-huh.
And how important is ambiguity to you?
Ambiguity is a universal. The world, it's a good question, and something, I mean, do we depend on relative? Or are there not universal ethos, love, compassion? And yet, the world is very gray. And it's easy to sit in judgment. And yet, you have to make decisions. You have to make black and white decisions. There's still a civil war over abortion. How do you feel if a baby is aborted, a baby, quote unquote, a fertilized egg is aborted 1 second after pregnancy as opposed to 9 months after pregnancy? There's a continuum there. So the whole world is full of gray areas in which we, as human beings, hopefully rely on those universals to make those decisions thereby. Love, compassion, humanity, generosity.
Do you find those ideas as something that you use in your art, those universals to communicate an emotion, or the ambiguity to perhaps allow it to fit not your situation, but many situations?
All of the above. Yeah, because they're, well, here, one poem that we have here is about wave and particle. Does the world exist through wave or particle? And that debate is still going on. So can we guide ourselves by relativity? Can we guide ourselves by constants? But they're both true at the same time. And it's our job as human beings to negotiate that very ambiguity, that it can be both at the same time. It can be wave and it can be particle.
I hope I don't get you in trouble now. Okay, go ahead.
But I wanted to say, I mean, David's a great musician, but if he looks at a sheet of sheet music, if 10 musicians look at that sheet of sheet music, you're going to get 10 different renditions of that, because the world is gray. Even though it's black and white on the page, it's very black and white on the page, but those gradations, a little more legato here, a little less here, but so the world is full of grayness, gray ambiguity.
So this, again, I hope I don't get you in trouble here, but I'm going to ask you to see if you can draw the line.
Okay.
We have lyrics.
Uh-huh.
We have rap.
Uh-huh.
And we have poetry.
Uh-huh.
As a master wordsmith, how would you kind of draw at least a little bit of some territories for those 3 ideas, approaches?
That's a good question. And I was it this morning on the way to work or yesterday? I was listening, I don't even know who it was, listening to some rap lyrics, and they were really wonderful. I mean, there's really brilliant rhymes in rap, in many rap, that I think is so exciting. But song, and this is a great generalization, song lyrics tend to be about June and moon and love. So they tend to boil down, and again, this is a gross generalization, they're often sentimental, and they don't rise to the sublime. And in music, you often, here's a great case. 2 years ago, we all debated, does Dylan deserve the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? Do you remember this? Dylan was given the Nobel Prize for Literature. Bob Dylan. Yeah, Bob Dylan. Well, we debated this at Gabriel's house. He's a great lyricist. Does it rise to poetry? Occasionally. But when you have music, melody backing it, my point being that the lyrics have to stand on their own. If they can't stand, if you need the music in the background to make it work, I'm a little suspicious.
So now we have any students who faced the blank page as he has and looked for a muse, who've gone through periods where you've been able to write and dry periods where you haven't. You know, maybe you've engaged the creative brain and the editor brain. Anybody who has any questions for Mr. Kronen, please.
What do you think is the cause of not being able to write constantly for a month, for example, like you say now? What do you think that usually stems from?
She asked why dry periods in writing. I think that's a good question. Writing is very exhausting, is extremely exhausting. So you need a break. But also, my wife's a novelist, so she gets almost no break, because I can write a poem, and I'll spend 2-3 months on a poem, and then I'm exhausted, and I can take a break because that poem's done. She's a novelist, and it never ends, and she's exhausted. So, and also, you have to chop the wood and carry the water. I mean, I have to wash the dishes and do the laundry, and life goes on. And but I think the short answer is writing is exhausting, and need to gather my forces again. Yeah, that's a good question.
Do you seek for perfection when you write your poem?
Utterly. He asked, do you seek for perfection when I write my poems? And yes, utterly. Now, is perfection, what is perfection? And whatever it is it available? I forget what poets or what novelists said, a work is never finished, it's merely abandoned.
Might have been Spielberg. Or Lucas, it was one of the two.
Really?
It was either Spielberg or Lucas. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Because you never get it that right. You can get it, it's kind of like the speed of light. Supposedly we can approach the speed of light, but we can't reach the speed of light. Yeah, but utterly, I mean, shoot for it. I'll work months and months and months until I think I got it as right as I can get it.
Another question? Is there a poet in here? Are you poets here? Any writers? Any lyricists? Yes, it's a question.
So during these really trying times, where you have dry spells, what motivates you? What gets you up in the morning to just continue writing, even though it's been months at a time when you have to?
That he asked during those dry spells, what gets you going again? Well, that's a good question. In a lot of, I mean, it all seems utter vanity. Like, I'm going to write words, and they're going to mean something to somebody. Well, that's pretty silly.
You know, sometimes when I read your poetry, it seems as they're triggered by an event, like your hand alighting across your wife, and just realizing what a treasure she is, and so sometimes it seems it's those things in your life that inspire you.
Utterly.
Things that happen. And or nature or music, or do you have any other muses or people or
All of the above, because you never know, or like a moment a little incident can get your brain going, or quite often with writing, poetry in particular, writing in general, you got sounds going, or I'll hear a phrase, or a phrase will be in my head, and I'll start with that. And you were talking about sounds earlier, and that'll generate, hopefully, more lines. But also, I'm not very good at many things in the world. So to answer your question, after a while, I want to write again. And so what I was saying before, the way to write is you read great writers, you read great poets, and that primes the pump.
Okay, so I think we have time for another question or two, and then I think we'd love to hear some poems.
Okay, great.
Yes.
I know that there's different types of writing and poetry. So, would you consider yourself more of a freestyle writer, or like more of a structured, like a rhythm to it?
That's a great question. And the short answer is a formalist, more structured. I love old-fashioned meter and rhyme. The three poems we have here are all rhymed and metered to some extent. It thrills me. What I was saying about some rap songs when I hear them, really brilliant rhymes, and I find that exciting. And also, especially if you're beginning to write, that structure really helps you. Because otherwise, again, you just end up babbling. But if you got to write a sonnet, you have certain guidelines, you have certain parameters which you have to fulfill. And that keeps you from wandering off into space.
So limitations aren't necessarily limitations sometimes.
Utterly. Limitations will set you free.
And one more question, and we'll have some poems. One more? No? We don't have to have one more question. Anybody else? Any professors or any of our colleagues here would like to ask one? All right, there she is.
Okay.
Yeah, just like to follow up. Do you feel like sometimes like you find yourself like making that block for that dry spell? Like, do you sometimes just feel like you can't write anything at that moment, so you want to give yourself that time off?
That's a very good question. She asked, do you give yourself time off in those dry spells? And yeah, I think like anything in life, you need breaks, and there's kind of natural rhythms that you got to tap into. Or like a poem itself, there's white space between stanzas.
Do poets keep a trunk? So songwriters have a trunk of material. So if something comes up and you're not necessarily inspired, you can pull one of the songs that you've previously written out of the trunk. And sometimes it doesn't fit quite as perfectly as it could. But if you're really in desperate need of meeting a deadline or finding inspiration when there's none, the trunk can be a friend. Do you have a trunk as a poet?
I don't so much, but I know a lot of poets who do keep notebooks and keep notes. And I have gone back to failed poems and tried to play with them, and sometimes succeeding going back, giving a different twist, a different context. Sometimes if you just give it the right title, then everything else falls into place. Because you've set the context for everything, but you didn't know that at the time, and it's kind of a mess. So you have to guide it.
So we'll leave you to the poems.
Oh, okay. The first 5-6 rows have poems there to read along. Before I begin, I want to thank David and Brenda and everybody. Jennifer, everybody at the Kendall Library and the campus for inviting me. This is a wonderful series, and thank you everybody for coming out to hear me today. And I want to say too, it's particularly gratifying to me because I was a student here. I worked in the library as a student 46 years ago. So I feel like I'm home. No, well, let me turn off my phone. I'm so nervous. It'll ring. Okay. Let's read, since we were talking about aging, there's a poem called My Younger Self. And this goes to David's question, and something I think about all the time, just what David asked. In about 20 years ago, Paul Newman was on 60 Minutes. Raise your hand if you know who Paul Newman is. Okay, good. Paul Newman, big Hollywood actor. And he died about 10, 15 years ago now. And anyway, he was on 60 Minutes, and they're interviewing him. And they were showing him his old films of himself, you know, when he's 25 and stuff. And he looked at it, and he said, I don't even know who that guy is. I don't recognize that guy. Because he was like 80-ish at the time. So this is called My Younger Self. Forgive him. He didn't know what he did. Exuberant, headlong kid who had no need to squint or ask you to repeat directions, which he would have ignored had you, a consummate bore, repeated them. You who has peed and repeed each hour of the night now in wakes, at times full of regret, for something you half recall and half forget, and which long ago made a loved one ache. Forgive him, frolicsome as a puppy in a basket. He meant no harm, but confident, was perhaps a little abrupt, having some place to get to. Though he will not outpace you, you who dawdle now and hesitate, and soon will be on time and late. Instead of me just reading poems, any questions, any thoughts, let me, when I teach poetry to students, I always have them read it at least twice in the class. Let me read it again. I'll read it more quickly. Because things clarify, you know, the more you hear a song, the more you read it. My Younger Self. And this isn't about Paul Newman, it's about me. Forgive him. He didn't know what he did. Exuberant, headlong kid who had no need to squint or ask you to repeat directions, which he would have ignored had you, a consummate bore, repeated them. You who has peed and repeed each hour of the night now, and wakes at times full of regret for something you half recall and half forget, and which long ago made a loved one ache. Forgive him, frolicsome as a puppy in a basket. He meant no harm, but confident, was perhaps a little abrupt, having some place to get to. Though he will not outpace you, you who dawdle now and hesitate, and soon will be on time and late. Any questions or thoughts about content or about, as you were asking about formalities in the poem? Yes.
What wise words would you tell your younger self now that you have a little more experience?
That, again, that's a good question. And again, same answer, I wouldn't have listened. But, and again, this is a balance between poles. But more and more, as I get older, it's just like, let it go. Let it go. But there's some things you shouldn't let go. So, but things that would enrage me or obsess me when I was younger, it's just like, give it up, let it go. Speaking of letting it go. Okay, how much time do I have?
I would love to hear at least 2 more poems.
Okay, let me, give me that, don't smite me. This, speaking of form, this is a villanelle, and it has a very specific form, but it's all anyway. If you want to read 2 great villanelles, do you know Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gently Into the Good Night, and Elizabeth Bishop One Art? So those are villanelles. Anyway, in this poem, it strikes me, this is called Gimme That, Don't Smite Me. It strikes me that human beings tend to have 2 prayers when they pray, and they're either gimme that or don't smite me. So this poem is Gimme That, Don't Smite Me. The smear beneath the microscope lamplight. So it's medical, looking at a smear of blood on a slide, right? The smear beneath the microscope lamplight is like stained glass midsummer. Don't smite me. When the sun, broken free of the squat horizon, burns off pixel and photon and simmers, give me that. Mid-sky, heating the air, making the sperm tail kite flash and plunge and rise over the heads of the swimmers. Don't smite me. Themselves plunging and rising, rising and plunging. What did we want then, up to our waists in the luxurious ocean? The somersaulting, give me that, toy at its height, that we could dismiss it with a splashing hand. Some more, some more, some more. Don't smite me. The sun growing small as a period, as if it couldn't be placed one day at the end of the list, the sentence, the summary. Give me that. Don't smite me. So, should I? Okay. Schrodinger's cab. If you don't have a copy, if you Google my name quickly and put in the title, the poem should come up. You all know the experiment of Schrodinger's cat. Is the cat alive in the box? Anyway, it gets more complicated than that. Schrodinger made this thought experiment to prove how particle and wave could not exist. It couldn't be reconciled because the cat can't be both alive and both dead. It's either alive or dead. And yet, Schrodinger's cab. In a biography of Schrodinger, this sentence was taken from it. He had to leave, and now I forget already, he had to leave Paris, he and his wife, quickly because the Nazis were not pleased with him, and they took off quickly. They did not dare take a taxi to the station for fear their departure might be reported to the authorities. Schrodinger's cab. This is a villanelle also. You won't be sure of its arrival until it rolls up to your curb. Wave, the cabbie'll say, farewell. All you own's inside your satchel. The cabbie says you'll beat the curfew. You won't be sure if he's a rival. Or if these roads lead to the terminal, where, huddled in their roundhouse, cars point to or from the far walls of your city. You'll pat your pockets for the schedule. The cab backfires and hugs its curve, and you won't be sure if it's a rifle, or why the heart beating out the spatial is agitated at its core. Something at the center feral. These posted signs, the engine's purr, your traveling light along this course. You won't be sure just how your eye falls where you're bound, and why that feels, in passing, like free will. Thank you.
So please take a moment and thank Mr. Kronen for his coming.